everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and in this video we're going to be continuing off from where we left off. In the last video we essentially did all of the setup for our UI, or most of it rather, and today we're going to look at how we can sort of wire the UI up with our code, okay? So essentially what we need is we need references to these hearts, we need references to this text in our code, and we're going to do that a little bit similar to how we had done it before. So I'm going to go into my game manager, and the game manager once again is acting essentially as sort of like our brain for the game. It is aware of everything. It's aware of our score, it's aware of our number of lives, and so on and so forth. So this just seems like a logical place to take care of it. In a bigger game, you might want to drop in, essentially break stuff down into different, more specific classes, like a UI manager class, just because there's so much, but in this case, that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple of public variables, and I'm going to call it public image, and I'll say life 01. Now notice, not image conversion, but image. Notice when I do that, Visual Studio is not immediately going to recognize this as a type, and the reason for that is because we need to make some imports. So going all the way up here on the top, what I need to do is we need to do using Unity Engine .ui, okay? And once we go ahead and do that, you'll notice how this becomes green, which is great, okay? What this means though is if I quickly save and if I tab on over back to Unity, and once Unity's had a chance to load, notice how over here our game manager script, just like it was looking, just like it was listening for, zombies, and we could drag and drop them in. We can also drag and drop our lives, essentially icons. So for example, what I could do is I could go ahead and do something like this, and now we have a reference to our image, and we can toggle it on and off, essentially. So what we're going to be doing, like we talked about, is essentially just turning these off and on, and that's going to create the effect of essentially losing a life. Okay, so going back to my code, I can go ahead and do that a couple of more times. So I can go ahead and do this, and I can go ahead and do this. I can change this to life 02 and life 03, and now we have references to each of our lives. We'll also get a reference to our text, basically, because we're going to need to update that as well. So score text, let's go ahead and say switch on over and drag and drop all of these into the inspector, okay? So going on to my game manager, and notice over here we've got all these empty fields, so we'll go ahead and fill them up, heart 2, heart 3, and score text, okay? And now in doing so, we can actually access these fields, or these essentially elements in our code. Okay. So the first thing that we can really quickly do is wire up the score text. Okay, so every time that we smash essentially an enemy, we call this function from our input class, and this is where we were increasing our score, okay? So as soon as we have increased our score, we can think about how we can update the UI. So essentially, we can say scoreText.text. So scoreText.text allows us to actually set the text value of that text field, okay? And what we can do is we can say zombie smashed, okay? And zombie smashed is actually an integer, and we're going to put it in this text field. So what we can do is we can say, hey, convert this to a string, and therefore it fits really well into this text box, okay? So if I save now, essentially, and if I jump back, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this debug line as well, since we don't need it anymore. And if I jump back into Unity, and if I give it a second to load, notice how it's starting off at 99 because that's just what we set it as, but now it seems to be actually updating as we want. So what we want to do is we don't want this to essentially start at 99. So we can do a couple of things. First of all, we can just go in the score text, and we can by default set this to 0. And since we've already changed it over here, just for good measure, what we can do is we can switch on back to our code, and we can go all the way up here, and actually in our start, right where we initialize zombie smashed, we can also say, hey, scoreText.text is equals to zombies smashed.toString. And we know that at this point in time in the code, when the game first starts, zombie smashed to 0, so it will automatically programmatically set it to 0. So if later, if you now switch back, and even if this number here is something else and it's not 0, then it should still programmatically change it to 0. If I hit play now, just to quickly test and see if everything is working, and so far so good. Alright, so now we've taken care of the score part. What we now need to think about doing is how we can essentially update our life. Alright, so to update our life, what we're going to do is notice this part here is falling is where we were essentially reducing our lives. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to write some code here, which is going to update the UI. Now, since we're going to be doing UI code here, it's just probably better if we create a new function instead of just dumping all of that UI code in here. So just so that our update function doesn't look too cluttered as it already does. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function, and we can call this private void update life UI, and what we can do is we will then call this function over here. Okay. Furthermore, we will essentially do this game over check in our function, so we don't necessarily need it here, so we can just get rid of it here, and over here we can say, hey, call the update life UI function. Okay, so now we can start thinking about what sort of stuff we actually want to do in this function, and that is essentially we want to disable and enable those images. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we can do an if condition, and depending on the number of lives that we have remaining, we can essentially decide what UI state needs to display. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, hey, if lives remaining is equal to 3. Okay, now to be honest, in this function, the first time that it comes here, it's already going to have life being reduced to 2. So it's never actually really going to be 3, but just for good measure, in case somehow we end up here with life remaining being 3, the game doesn't essentially just break or collapse. So just to prevent a crash, we're going to go ahead and write that statement down. And similarly, what we can do is we can copy this and we can say, hey, when life remaining is equal to 2, 1, and 0. So, okay, 2, 1, and 0. Okay, and you can imagine that this here is game over, essentially. So the part where we did about setting the game over boolean, we can say game over is now equals to true. So now we have that part in there. Okay. Now what we can do is we can use these references to these images, and we can enable and disable them. Okay. So if life remaining equals to 3, then what we want is essentially all 3 of these to be enabled. Okay. So if I switch back, what that looks like is we can say life01 dot game object dot set active equals true. Okay. Now at the start of the game, we're going to by default have all of them active. Okay. So this is just if something is active and you make it active again, it remains active. Okay. So we can go ahead and just copy this, and we can say, hey, we want all 3 of our lives to be essentially visible there. Okay. Now, when we come here and we lose our first life, I'm going to copy paste all 3 of these. What we want is we want this third life to then become inactive. Okay, so essentially what we want is heart number 3 to become inactive. Okay, now notice how I'm unchecking this in the inspector. The way to do that essentially in code is by setting active to false. So what I can do is I can say life03.gameObject.setActive equals false. Okay. Once again, we can copy this and we can say, hey, if life remaining equals to 1, then we want to set the second one from the right to false. And lastly, if we have 0 life, then not only do we want to be game over, but we want to set all of our hearts to false. Okay? Okay, so really quickly, let's go over what we just did. We created a new function, and we called it previously every time after we reduce our life. and this function is in fact responsible for updating the UI for our lives. And we said, hey, every time I come in here, I will check. Every time I come in here, basically, what that means is it's time for me to update the UI. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to look at what my live remaining variable is. I'm going to look at the value, and depending on that value, I'm going to update the UI. Okay, so if I quickly switch over, and if we play the game now, let's see what happens. Okay, so my score seems to be working. Now let's see what happens when we miss a few. Alright, we lose a life, we lose a second one, and now we should lose the third one. And now it's game over. Okay, so everything so far is coming along pretty good. What we want to do now, though, is that we want to have some sort of a game over screen so that the user knows that the game has ended, because right now the game is just stuck. So we want to give the user a way to essentially be able to restart our game and play again. Okay, so the way we're going to create a restart button is essentially going to be, we'll go on Canvas, we'll right click, and we'll look for a UI button. Okay, and this is essentially a button. If I hit the play button now, you'll notice that the button is just lying there, and I can click on it, and obviously nothing happens. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is inside this button there is this text. As you can see, if I disable it, it goes away. We don't really necessarily need this text at the moment, so we're going to go ahead and delete it. Okay. Furthermore, we want the restart button to be big, and it's already in the center of the screen, but we want it to be big. So we're going to go ahead and increase the width to about, I don't know, 400, and we can make the height to about 300, so it takes up a big chunk of our space. Okay. Similar to our images, the button also has an image component or an image script attached to it, and at the moment it's using this empty sort of white sprite. So if you go over into our resources folder, we have a game over button, and we can go ahead and drag and drop that in here. So this is this right here is the game over sort of button sprite. I can drag it and I can put it here in like so. Okay, and this is what our game over button looks like. Once again, if I hit play now, it's always going to be there, and our game will be in the background. Obviously, we don't want that, but this is what it looks like. So what we can do is we can go ahead and disable this button like so, and we can call this the game over button. Okay. Okay, so now that we have our game over button, the reason why we disabled it is because we don't want it to be showing all the time. But when the game finishes, we can activate it, okay? And you might already know how we're going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'll go over to our scripts, and once again, we'll create a new public field, okay? And we can call this public button game over button, okay? I'm going to save, and I'm going to switch back to Unity. Okay, I'm going to give Unity a second to load, and now in my game manager I see that it's waiting for me to put in a button here, so I can go ahead and drag and drop my button like so. Okay, so now when I switch on back over to my code, what I can do is back here, when we were calling game over, what we can do is we can say game over button dot set active, or rather game object dot set active true, and if I save and if I go back to Unity and if I give it a second to load, if I now hit play, everything should be working according to the plan. Okay, we lose 2 life, and now boom, you see the game over button. Now, of course, clicking the button doesn't do anything at this point, but this is going to be a great stopping point. So thank you so much, everybody. Great work, and I will see you in the next video.